In the shadow of ancient history, in the spaces between the official narratives and the suppressed truths, in the hidden chambers where sacred knowledge has been preserved through the ages, there exists a story so profound, so revolutionary, so fundamentally challenging to everything that institutional Christianity has taught, that it has been deliberately hidden, systematically distorted, and carefully erased from human consciousness for nearly 2,000 years. This is the story of Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline, a truth that reveals that Mary Magdalene was not a repentant prostitute as the Church has portrayed her, but was a priestess of the highest order, a carrier of the dragon consciousness, a woman who understood the true nature of the divine feminine and who worked with Christ to awaken humanity to the knowledge of the Sacred Mother. This is the story of how the dragon bloodline, which Mary Magdalene carried and transmitted, was not about genetic inheritance in the conventional sense, but was about the transmission of consciousness, about the awakening of the divine feminine principle within all beings, about the knowledge that would eventually restore balance to human civilization. And this is the story of why the Church worked with such ferocity to suppress this knowledge, to demonize Mary Magdalene, to erase the dragon bloodline from history, because they understood that if humanity ever fully recognized the truth about Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline, the entire structure of patriarchal religious authority would collapse. The story begins in the time of Christ, in the years of his ministry, in a period when the boundaries between the material world and the spiritual realms were far more permeable than they are in our modern age. In those days, there were women of great spiritual power, women who had been trained in the ancient mystery schools, women who understood the nature of consciousness and the path of spiritual awakening. Among these women was Mary Magdalene. Though this was not her only name, not her only identity, not her only role in the great work of spiritual transformation that was unfolding. Mary Magdalene was born into a family that had preserved the ancient knowledge of the divine feminine, the knowledge of the dragon consciousness that had been passed down through generations of priestesses who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. From her earliest childhood, Mary Magdalene understood that something was profoundly wrong with the world as it had been presented to her, that the teachings of the official priesthood were distortions of the truth, that the divine was not exclusively masculine but possessed both masculine and feminine aspects, with the feminine being the primary principle from which all things emerged. She was trained in the mystery schools, learning the practices and disciplines that would activate the dragon consciousness within her, learning how to perceive dimensions of reality that were invisible to ordinary awareness, learning how to access the infinite wisdom and infinite power that existed within the divine feminine. She learned meditation practices that would expand her consciousness. She learned the sacred geometry that encoded the knowledge of the divine feminine. She learned the symbols that represented the path of awakening, and most importantly, she learned that she was not separate from the divine, that she was an expression of the divine feminine consciousness, that she carried within herself the power to awaken others to their own divine nature. She learned that the dragon bloodline was not about genetic inheritance, but was about the transmission of consciousness, about the awakening of the divine feminine principle within all beings. When Mary Magdalene encountered Christ, she recognized in him a being who understood the truth, who possessed the consciousness that had been suppressed by the patriarchal religions, who was committed to the awakening of consciousness in all beings. She recognized that Christ understood the divine feminine, that he honored the Sacred Mother, that he was teaching a path of awakening that was fundamentally different from the teachings of the official priesthood. And so Mary Magdalene became one of Christ's most important students, one of his closest companions, one of the carriers of his true teachings. She was not a passive follower, but was an active participant in the great work of spiritual transformation that Christ was undertaking. She was trained by Christ in the deepest mysteries, was initiated into the highest levels of spiritual understanding, was empowered to become a teacher and a leader in her own right. Together, Mary Magdalene and Christ worked to awaken consciousness to the knowledge of the divine feminine, to teach that the Sacred Mother was co-equal with the Divine Father, to establish a community in which women and men were equal, in which the sacred feminine was honored alongside the sacred masculine. Together, they worked to transmit the dragon bloodline consciousness, to ensure that the knowledge would not be completely lost, to create networks of initiates who would carry the teaching forward through the ages. But after the crucifixion of Christ, the institutional church began to consolidate its power. The church declared that Christ was the sole savior, that salvation could only come through the church, that the divine was exclusively masculine. The church worked systematically to suppress the teachings of Christ about the divine feminine, to erase the role of Mary Magdalene, to establish itself as the sole authority on spiritual matters. And so the church created a narrative in which Mary Magdalene was portrayed as a repentant prostitute, a woman who had been saved by Christ, a woman who was subordinate and inferior. This narrative served the purposes of the church. By portraying Mary Magdalene as a sinner, the church could suppress the knowledge that she was a priestess, a teacher, a carrier of the dragon consciousness. By erasing her true role, the church could prevent others from recognizing that women could be spiritual leaders, that the divine feminine was equal to the divine masculine, that the dragon bloodline consciousness could awaken in all beings. The story of the recovery of the truth about Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline in the modern world begins with a woman named Mary, a woman who carries within her the consciousness of Mary Magdalene, who is living through the experience of awakening in her own life. Mary is a scholar, a mystic, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to the study of suppressed texts, to the decoding of hidden messages, to the understanding of the deeper truths that lay beneath the surface of official Christian history. Mary had always felt drawn to the figure of Mary Magdalene, drawn to the mystery of who she truly was, drawn to the knowledge that the official church had deliberately distorted her story. She had spent decades researching, studying the apocryphal Gospels, comparing different versions of Gospel accounts, looking for evidence of what had been hidden, for clues about the true nature of Mary Magdalene's relationship with Christ and her role in the great work of spiritual transformation. She had discovered that in the earliest accounts of the life of Christ, Mary Magdalene was portrayed not as a prostitute, but as a priestess, as a teacher, as an equal partner with Christ in the great work of awakening consciousness. She had found evidence that the church had deliberately rewritten these accounts, had transformed Mary Magdalene from a priestess into a sinner, had suppressed the knowledge of her true role and her true power. It was during a deep meditation in a sacred cave, a place that was said to have been where Mary Magdalene had retreated after the crucifixion, that Mary received a vision that would change the course of her life. In this vision, she found herself in the presence of Mary Magdalene herself, a being of immense wisdom and power who had been working through the ages to preserve the truth, to guide the awakening of consciousness, to ensure that the knowledge would not be completely lost. "You have been called," Mary Magdalene said to her, her voice resonating with the authority of ages and the tenderness of infinite love. "You have been chosen because you carry within you the consciousness of those who came before you, because you have the capacity to understand what others cannot perceive, because you are willing to pay the price that understanding demands. The time has come for the truth about me to be revealed. The time has come for the world to understand who I truly was, what the dragon bloodline represents, what the suppression of this knowledge has cost humanity, and you have been prepared your entire life for this moment." Mary emerged from this vision transformed. She understood that she had been given access to knowledge that had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. knowledge that could reshape the entire understanding of Christianity and Western spirituality. She understood that her role was to help restore the truth, to help humanity awaken to the reality that lay beneath the lies that had been constructed. She began to research with new urgency, looking for evidence of the true Mary Magdalene in the suppressed texts, in the symbols that had been preserved, in the fragmentary accounts that had survived despite centuries of suppression. She discovered that Mary Magdalene had been a priestess of the highest order, trained in the mystery schools, initiated into the deepest knowledge of the divine feminine, empowered by Christ to become a teacher and a leader. She discovered that the dragon bloodline that Mary Magdalene carried and transmitted was not about genetic inheritance, but was about the transmission of consciousness, about the awakening of the divine feminine principle within all beings. She discovered that the dragon bloodline represented the knowledge that the divine feminine was not subordinate to the masculine, but was co-equal with it, and in fact was the primary principle from which all things emerged. She discovered that Mary Magdalene had worked actively to preserve and transmit this knowledge, that she had established networks of initiates who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation, that she had ensured that the knowledge would not be completely lost, that it would be available when the time came for humanity to awaken. She discovered that the Church had worked systematically to suppress the knowledge of Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline. The Church had rewritten the Gospels to minimize her role. The Church had created a narrative in which she was portrayed as a sinner rather than as a priestess. The Church had established itself as the sole authority on spiritual matters, claiming that salvation could only come through the Church, that the divine was exclusively masculine. She discovered that the suppression of the dragon bloodline consciousness had created a fundamental imbalance in human consciousness, an imbalance that had led to the domination of women, the suppression of the divine feminine, the creation of systems of power that were based on control and domination rather than on love and cooperation. Mary began to work with other researchers and spiritual teachers who had also recognized the truth about Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline, who understood that the suppression of this knowledge had had profound consequences for human consciousness and human civilization, who were committed to the revelation of the truth to humanity. Together, they began to decode the suppressed texts, to understand the deeper meanings that had been hidden, to recognize how the truth had been preserved in symbols and metaphors that had survived the Church's attempts to erase it. They discovered that Mary Magdalene had been represented in various symbols throughout Christian tradition. The rose, the alabaster jar, the tower, all of these symbols represented Mary Magdalene, the priestess who carried the dragon consciousness, the woman who had been suppressed and demonized by the Church. They discovered that these symbols had been preserved in art and architecture and sacred geometry, that the knowledge of Mary Magdalene had been encoded into the very structures that the Church had created. They discovered that Mary Magdalene had been preserved in the mystical traditions, in the secret societies, in the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of those who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. They discovered that the knowledge had never been completely lost, but had been preserved in hidden forms, waiting for the time when it could be fully revealed. They discovered that the dragon bloodline consciousness was not limited to a few exceptional individuals, but was available to all beings who possessed the understanding and the commitment to awaken it. They discovered that the false narrative of Mary Magdalene as a sinner had been created specifically to prevent people from recognizing that women could be spiritual leaders, that the divine feminine was equal to the masculine, that the dragon bloodline consciousness could awaken in all beings. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Mary spent years developing a comprehensive teaching that would help others understand the true nature of Mary Magdalene, that would guide them toward the recognition of the dragon bloodline consciousness within themselves, that would help them understand that they too could awaken to the consciousness that Mary Magdalene had awakened to. She wrote books that were published under various names. She created videos and online courses. She established networks of practitioners who were working together to awaken the dragon bloodline consciousness within themselves and to help others do the same. She worked with women's groups, showing them how Mary Magdalene had been a priestess and a teacher, how the dragon bloodline consciousness was particularly accessible through the awakening of the feminine principle within all beings. She worked with spiritual teachers from different traditions, showing them how the knowledge of Mary Magdalene appeared in their own traditions, how their own traditions had preserved fragments of the ancient knowledge, how the awakening that was happening in the present moment was the fulfillment of what Mary Magdalene had worked toward. But as Mary's work became more widely known, she began to encounter resistance. There were those within the institutional church who saw her work as a threat, who feared that the revelation of the truth about Mary Magdalene would undermine their authority and their control. There were academic institutions that tried to suppress her research, to prevent her books from being published, to discredit her work. And there were more subtle forms of resistance as well. Mary began to experience strange phenomena, synchronicities that seemed designed to test her commitment, challenges that appeared to be obstacles, but which were actually initiations, opportunities to deepen her understanding and her faith in the truth that she had been given. But Mary understood that this resistance was itself a sign of the truth of what she had discovered. The fact that there was such desperate opposition to the revelation of the truth about Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline only confirmed that something of immense power and significance was indeed occurring, that the suppressed knowledge was indeed beginning to emerge into human consciousness. She also came to understand something profound about the nature of Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline and the reason for their suppression. She understood that Mary Magdalene represented a form of consciousness that was fundamentally incompatible with patriarchal religious authority. She understood that if consciousness ever fully recognized that Mary Magdalene was a priestess and a teacher, that the divine feminine was equal to the masculine, that the dragon bloodline consciousness could awaken in all beings, the entire structure of patriarchal religious authority would collapse. She understood that the suppression of Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline was not accidental. It was deliberate, systematic, rooted in a fundamental understanding that the knowledge of the dragon bloodline consciousness was incompatible with systems of patriarchal control. She understood that the church had worked methodically to suppress this knowledge because they understood that if it ever emerged, if consciousness ever recognized that women could be spiritual leaders, that the divine feminine was equal to the masculine, the entire foundation of patriarchal authority would crumble. In her final years, Mary worked to synthesize all of the knowledge she had gathered to create a comprehensive teaching that would serve as a guide for the awakening of the dragon bloodline consciousness in human awareness. She wrote a final book that was intended to be her magnum opus, a complete guide to understanding the true nature of Mary Magdalene, recognizing the dragon bloodline consciousness within oneself, and participating in the great work of transformation that would restore the knowledge of Mary Magdalene to the center of human consciousness. When Mary died, her work lived on. The knowledge she had preserved and transmitted continued to spread, reaching people in every corner of the world. More and more people began to understand that Mary Magdalene had been a priestess and a teacher, that the dragon bloodline was not about genetic inheritance, but about consciousness, that they themselves possess the potential to awaken this consciousness. And in our own time, we are witnessing the revelation of the truth about Mary Magdalene and the dragon bloodline in unprecedented ways. We are seeing women rising to claim their spiritual authority and their voice. We are seeing the recognition of the divine feminine as equal to the masculine. We are seeing the collapse of institutions that had been built on the suppression of this knowledge. We are seeing the emergence of new forms of Christianity that honor the true teachings of Christ, that recognize Mary Magdalene as a priestess and a teacher, that understand spirituality as a path of awakening rather than a system of control. Mary Magdalene is no longer suppressed. The truth about the dragon bloodline is being revealed. The divine feminine is being recognized as equal to the masculine. And those who are ready to receive this knowledge, who are willing to open their hearts and minds to the wisdom of Mary Magdalene, who are committed to the awakening of the dragon bloodline consciousness within themselves and within all beings, are being called to step forward, to recognize their role in the great work of transformation. Mary Magdalene was a priestess, a teacher, a carrier of the dragon bloodline consciousness. She worked with Christ to awaken humanity to the knowledge of the divine feminine. The church suppressed her story because it represented a threat to patriarchal authority. But the truth cannot be hidden forever. The dragon bloodline consciousness cannot be suppressed indefinitely. The knowledge that Mary Magdalene preserved is emerging into human consciousness once again. And the question that is being posed to each of us is this: will you recognize Mary Magdalene as a priestess and a teacher? Will you awaken to the dragon bloodline consciousness that she carried and transmitted? Will you help to guide others toward the recognition of the divine feminine that Mary Magdalene honored? Will you participate in the spiritual transformation that will restore the knowledge of Mary Magdalene to the center of human consciousness? Mary Magdalene is calling. The dragon bloodline is awakening. The suppressed truth is being revealed, and the healing and transformation of all consciousness is beginning. The time of suppression is ending. The time of revelation is beginning, and you are invited to become part of this great awakening, to claim your role in the restoration of the knowledge that Mary Magdalene preserved, to help guide humanity toward the recognition of the divine feminine that will reshape all creation. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.